Welcome to today's episode of Good Grief Believer. I'm the host, Julie Craig, and I am delighted today to be meeting with best-selling author, producer, and podcaster Clarissa Moll.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here, Clarissa. I receive Christianity Today, and in this recent magazine that I received, I saw Clarissa's new book, Hope Comes to Stay. And it is a wonderful, wonderful book to help children navigate grief. And I already have somebody in mind that I need to gift this book to. So, Clarissa, thank you so much for coming on to talk about your experience and particularly to talk about how we help children navigate grief.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Clarissa, would you just start by giving a little bio of yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I am a mom of four in a blended family of nine. We live in New England and in a very full, loud, and, and messy house. And our life is indelibly marked by loss. When my first husband died, my late husband died in 2019 in a hiking accident. I pretty much thought that our life was over. I became a young widow with four children to raise alone. And the last 6 years have been a process of figuring out what it means to live with grief and to rebuild after a tragic loss, and not just to survive, but to really find a life, develop a life, build a life that we could love again.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I've been through a process similar, and that idea that you can go from a time when you feel like you will never feel joy again to actually having a life that is full, not just treading water,
hmm
but actually full is really, it's a powerful idea. And I really am anxious to hear about your process of how you went from the darkest moment to now where you have a full life and you are actually helping a lot of people to navigate through that kind of loss. So your voice is so important,
Thank you.
and what you have to share is been just such a blessing.
Thank you.
So can you tell me about your husband?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rob was a wonderful guy. We were married for 17 years. He was a journalist and a great dad. He was an adventurer who uh, loved to spend time with his family whenever he could. Rob was also a writer, and 10 years before his death, he had been a hospice volunteer and had worked at a funeral home on the night shift. And he had done that in a desire to understand how families could face dying in the 21st century in a way that was life giving and didn't destroy their faith, and answered a lot of the persistent ethical questions that were happening in the early 2000s around the right to die and euthanasia. And so that work birthed a book called The Art of Dying, Living Fully into the Life to Come, a book that,
Wow.
yeah, arrived 10 years before his death. And so our life together
Wow.
was marked by conversations about death and loss far earlier than a lot of, I think, couples do. We had little kids running around our ankles, and Rob was processing a Saturday that he had spent in hospice, sitting with a patient who was dying. Or because we had one car at the time, I would cram all the kids into the minivan in the
Hmm.
evening, and we would drive dad to work at the funeral home for his night shift. And so, in many ways, this conversation about death and dying and loss was a conversation that I began having, sort of easing my way into that long before I ever had to come face to face with the deep and raw realities of it in my own life.
That is fascinating. That is really, really an amazing, not coincidence that he would have been doing that work and you would have been introduced to these ideas. How do you think that helped you when
Yeah.
you were going through these experiences of losing him.
Well, I've compared it to playing the piano, which is something that I did for years and years and years when I was a kid. You can listen to a minuet from Mozart. You can listen to a piece of Rachmaninoff, and you can listen to that piece over and over and over again and learn it. Uh, l- so that you could sing its tune backwards, frontwards, and every which way, but it's not until you place your hands on the keys and you actually have to practice that piece of music on your own that you discover that you really come to know it. And so I think for a lot of the conversations that we had around death and dying and grief, even, they were instrumental. They were foundational conversations. They were the listening to the Rachmaninoff over and over again so that I would know what came next, what logistics were necessary, what his desires were. But nothing can prepare you to actually place your hands on the keys, to actually have to engage with the funeral director, answer the questions of the medical examiner, stand beside the graveside. There's no trial run for any of that. And so, in many ways, even though I was very prepared for the logistics that come with death and dying, nothing I think could have prepared me for the grief that would follow.
Thank you. That is such a perfect metaphor. I can really relate to that because I also play the piano. And I remember, those early days of you want to sit and just be able to play a beautiful piece, but your fingers don't know what to do,
Mhm.
right? Your mind and your fingers aren't connected in that way yet. It takes so much practice. And it's an interesting thing we have in common because my late husband was widowed. Death was a guest at our wedding, right? And so for 25 years, we had these conversations. And even our own preparations for our mortality were probably more intact than for many others for whom death comes as a surprise. And now they have to deal with financial burdens and, just things that you don't always think ahead to plan for. But because he'd been a young widower, um, a lot of these things were things he put in place, but topics we talked about all the time. And that's such a great way to think about the piano. I'm really going to be thinking about this for a while about how similar that is. So really, when we apply that to normal life, getting people to talk about these topics is really important, isn't it?
It
It
is.
right?
Mhm.
What have you found?
Well, our culture is kind of interesting in how it talks about death and dying and grief. Um, we either avoid it at all costs, and we find that there is a strong anti-aging movement, even transhumanist movement. We want to pretend that we will somehow live forever. We prize youth at every cost. And then on the other side of that, we often ingest death as entertainment. Uh, we watch violent movies, we play violent video games. I think, even to some extent, the endless churn of the news with death and dying and suffering and sorrow, we can become kind of desensitized to it in that way. And so we're avoiding on both ends, avoiding by entirely avoiding and running away, and avoiding by sort of compartmentalizing violence and death and dying as something that we can turn on and off. That is pixelated and can be swiped up or bypassed when we feel like we've had too much. And so what that leaves us with is a culture that is bereft of a language around grief and loss, a culture that struggles with a vocabulary of consolation. We don't know how to take care of one another when we're suffering, and for those who are grieving, it leaves those folks without a map, without any sense of where to go next, how to survive, how to make their way in a world that is consistently broken even after their hardest losses. We really leave people in the lurch when it comes to talking about these important topics.
I agree. I think you're right about that. It was interesting. I interviewed an author, Jessica Fine, she went through her their family went through a really devastating loss of a daughter who had a genetic disorder that took her life, and but she was Jewish, and so they had these rituals that were set in place. And so when her daughter passed away, her community gathered and knew what to do, what to say, where to be, what to bring. And I think you're right. There's a lack of these cultural norms. I was personally really blessed because I'm part of a church community, and I had been part of the same church community for several years. So we had people who showed up, and my siblings and I are very close, and so my siblings showed up for me. Who showed up for you at this time? Where did you turn?
We were really blessed to also have a church community that was wonderful, to have family that was supportive and friends who we could rely on. But I know that that is not the case for everyone. And certainly we experience that to some extent ourselves. Any shared loss has ripples throughout your community of support. And even though you share in the loss of a particular person, everyone experiences that in different ways. And so I think one of the things that's difficult for grieving people is upon the experience of loss to discover who can show up and who can't show up. And there's a lot of judgment around that. There's a lot of critique. There's a lot of sorrow. It adds grief upon grief to reach out to a friend and feel like you've been ghosted, to stop receiving invitations to get together from family or friends. But the reality is that grief touches each of us in unique ways. And so often I find that it's not that friends don't care when they don't show up. Uh, they are often just don't know what to do.
Mhm.
And so it's a really difficult position for a griever to be placed in because they have all these big emotions, but they also feel like they need to educate those around them on how to take care of them. And there's a give and take there. Some days you'll be able to say, "Hey, I need to reach out to this person who gave the very vague but genuine. Let me know if I can be helpful." And
Mhm.
I have it within me. I have the bandwidth to be able to text that friend and say, "Hey, here's what I need. This would be helpful," and guide that person into being a supportive part of your community. And some days you just won't have that. You won't have the energy for it. You may have a lot of big and raw emotions, and you may be really frustrated that a vague offer like that is no offer at all. And so I think when we're talking about support, it's a really complicated weaving together of threads that are really torn apart to a greater extent, I think, than we even imagine when we first experience loss. That the person who loved my husband at work, who was his colleague, also misses him in that
Right.
dimension of their relationship. The dad or the mom who played with, coached with my husband or coached with my wife in Little League also feels that loss, and they're going to respond to it in particular kinds of ways. And when you're grieving, it's really helpful to keep your antenna up for the people who show up unexpectedly. Because one of the great joys that comes in our experience of loss, the grief is those who have pulled away perhaps and are trying to process that loss in their own way. But one of the joys is there are amazing people who sort of miraculously show up. For our family, it was our electrician. We were working on a fixer-upper house, and he had done a lot of work. He knew my husband, he knew my kids, and after my husband died, I reached out to him just for an average job. He showed up and said, "I learned that your husband had died. I'm so sorry." And after that, he would just text me every so often and check in on us, make sure that the new microwave that we had installed was still working, or that we weren't having trouble with the breaker box, asking if there was any way that he could help, going far beyond any kind of paying job that I would ever hire him for. And I never could have predicted that Joe would become a part of our circle of support. And yet he was, and it was really material, and it was very present, and it was really loving at a time where we felt like we needed to be seen and known.
I love that. God bless Joe. Oh, I love that. I had experiences like that too. I had a garage door that had had some problems, and and my husband had, he would have taken care of that. And the garage door opener guy that came to service the garage door looked around at my property and he said, "Do you have anyone helping you with this?" And I said, "No." and he basically became my part-time groundskeeper. He so and that's just I always felt like he was sent as a special gift from God, and probably my husband, who said, "She needs a little help here. Can you just send her somebody to?" Well, I love uh, in the book, Hope Comes to Stay. You actually introduced some characters into this book. And what I really loved about these characters is that there were different expressions or reactions that these characters had to the death of this little girl's father. And one that I wrote down that I was Aunt Mabel, who says to Mama, "Seems like the grief has lifted." you know. And I thought, yeah, there are people who say things like that. "Oh, looks like you're doing okay." Or Aunt Virginia, right? She has some little quip here. I've got to look it up and see what Aunt Virginia said. I remember that it or Aunt Mabel says, "The grief in this house is thick as a June fog." Oh, and then Aunt Virginia says, "Reckon it will let up once the summer ends." This idea that grief has a little timestamp, and you just kind of get through it, and then you move on, and everything's fine, and people are functioning, so their grief has gone. Were those characters based on your own experiences, or things you and your husband had discussed? Where did those characters come from?
Well, thankfully, there no one ever said those specific things to us. I'm
Okay, good.
really glad. But I have friends who have wondered at those things. And, as I work with bereaved folks in a variety of settings, whether it's children or teens or adults, everybody wants to know, when am I going to feel better? I think that's the bottom line for everyone who grieves. And it's the bottom line for everyone who is trying to be supportive to a grieving person. Those we love do not want to see us hurting, and we ourselves want to know when we can get past the sadness. And the reality is that once grief arrives in your life, it travels with you for the rest of your life. And in many ways, your life will grow around that grief. It will expand, grow beautiful, be complex. But the grief is always there. It doesn't get smaller, it just changes shape and adjusts to the life that you're living while you carry it along with you. And it's an important reality for children to understand in particular, because kids are very process oriented. They want to know, we give them sticker charts when we're potty training them. We give them goals that they can set for saving for their allowance. And so it totally makes sense that a child who has experienced something hard would say, "Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, when is this going to be over?" And it's important to teach our children from the very beginning that there is an element of suffering and brokenness that exists in the world, but that we are equipped to face it. We are resilient people. We are people of resurrection life, a new life that springs out of things that are dead. And with effort, with intention, with a lot of self compassion, we can face the things that are hard and not minimize them or rose colored glass them, but receive them, learn from them, and draw wisdom for the lives that we live as we carry those very hard experiences along with us.
That is such a good point. You're absolutely right with that. I really love that. One of the things that you had pointed out, and this is was very impactful to me, uh, which says, according to the Society of Pediatric Psychology, more than 5 million children will experience the death of a parent or sibling before the age of 18. That's a staggering statistic. 5 million children who will experience the death of a parent or sibling before the age of 18. And the grief and its impact in their life is often overlooked. That is absolutely true. And here is what the research shows that you've been able to share. Research tells us that young children benefit the most from concrete language about death and dying. Even very small children are able to grasp the concept of death in the natural world. And you give some examples: ants that they squish, plants that brown and shrivel. So we don't have to fear honest conversations about what happens to our loved ones when they die. That is a powerful message. And I think that's part of the reason why you wrote this book.
Yeah, when I think about raising my own children, my youngest had just turned 7. My oldest was 13, turning 14 when her dad died. And we have walked through almost every developmental stage of grief in childhood. And the reality is that my kids were not anomalies. 1 in 12 children in the US will have a parent or sibling die before they turn 18. The number vastly expands when you push that age into the college years and say, how many children will experience the death of a sibling or parent before the age of 25. We know when we layer on things like school shootings, domestic violence, kids are experiencing a lot of loss. And so my children aren't unique. 1 in 12 is 2 in every school classroom, 3 on every football
Right.
team. This is when we actually think about it in a granular way, there are a lot of children who really need care. And, we teach our children the ABCs before they write their college essays, right? I
Mm-hmm.
have 2 kids who are headed to college in the fall. And my goodness, we did not start teaching them the parts of speech and the ABCs in the last month. No, they learned it years before they would ever need to construct that complex essay. And that's what we want to do with children. In as much as Hope Comes to Stay is a book about loss for children who have experienced loss, to help them know that they're not alone, to help them normalize the feelings that come along with loss, the highs and lows and normals of being a kid who's experienced something hard. It's also a book for caregivers and teachers and parents who want to begin the ABCs kind of conversations with their kids about this inevitability. I mean, there's the joke that there are only 2 things that are inevitable in life, it's death and taxes.
Right.
If you're gonna give your kid an allowance and teach them about money when they're little, why not begin conversations about death too? And the beauty of a story like Hope Comes to Stay is that it's not didactic. It's a story. It's the way kids learn. They learn by watching others, particularly when they're little, 4, 5, 6 years old. We see it at play dates where you get 2 moms together and 2 kids, and the kids never talk to each other. They just play side by side. And
Right.
they're learning from one another in that parallel play. And so, what a little child can do in Hope Comes to Stay is sit with someone else's story, watch how that child goes through the process of loss, and in that sort of parallel play kind of way, learn about what it means to feel sad when someone dies, what it means to feel kind of normal and feel weird about feeling normal when someone dies,
Right.
to experience joy for the first time, to have questions, and especially to know who the safe adults are in your life with whom you can have those conversations, because we want kids to know that no matter what they face, that there are adults who will say, I love you, I'm sorry, and I'll walk with you through this hard thing toward flourishing.
I love that. What were the challenging issues for your kids? What did you find came up? Was it different for each kid, or were there patterns?
Yeah, parenting grieving children is like being a short order cook. You're
Okay.
making a different meal for everybody every night, and that's part of what is challenging about parenting a child through grief, particularly when you're carrying that loss. Also, there is a necessary compartmentalizing that happens. I had to decide what I was going to share with my kids and when, how much ugly crying they would see me do, and how much I needed to do in the shower, and then I also had to become a student of them. Instead of superimposing my adult views about grief on them, I needed to become a really good listener, to be an attentive watcher, to observe them and know their rhythms so that I could ask wondering questions. Yeah, I wonder how you're feeling today. I wonder how you responded to this particular situation. Tell me more. And really sit at their feet and learn from them, because the amazing thing is that our children don't have all of the cultural, religious, family related hangups around grief and loss that we do as adults. They have this pure understanding about the world, and we can learn a lot from them if we're willing to listen.
Wow. I think your kids are very fortunate that they had you for a mother. What a terribly difficult thing to experience. But again, it sounds like you were prepared in many ways. Of course, not always, but prepared just in the fact that you had a vocabulary to speak to them. You were comfortable speaking about death. You had been speaking about death and thinking about death. And do you do you think that people sometimes avoid speaking about death to children because they're afraid to make children afraid?
I think so. I think we don't want to hurt our children. We want to pretend that nothing bad will ever happen to them, wrap them up in bubble wrap, and keep them safe forever. And we don't want to think about them dying. We don't want to think about us dying and leaving them alone. And so we tend to avoid those conversations. But the reality is that if you had a child that you raised and you never talked about sexuality, that would be really bad by the time the child got older. You would
Right,
not be equipping them in the way that you needed to as a parent,
right.
because sexuality is a part of being a human, and death is part of being a human as well. And so, if we talk to our kids about those very rudimentary body kinds of conversations, with increasing complexity as they grow older, we can do the same thing with death and loss. You don't need to sit down with a 4-year old or a 6-year old and have a real heart to heart about the afterlife, or
Right,
about the intricacies of burial options. But
right.
do need to start the conversation about the realities of our mortality, because rather than making your child afraid, you're actually equipping your child not only to face the hard things that we know are inevitable for them, but to be a good friend and partner and supporter when they're called upon to be that person who needs to show up for someone else who's hurting.
I absolutely agree. And and as you were saying that, the verse that came to my mind was, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, right? The truth sets you free from fear, as opposed to being aware of what is reality causing, fear and anxiety. It can actually, as you said, equip you to handle things. And so that seems like a very good approach
Mhm.
with kids and children. Age appropriate, but yeah, speak about it, be open about it. And because we do live in a world where we don't have a lot of infant mortality, we don't have high child mortality like there was in, generations past, where they would be experiencing death maybe more commonly than we do. It is important, isn't it,
Mhm.
that we talk about these things in age appropriate ways. I like that. I appreciated one of the things that you brought up was the when you start to feel normal and happy, and is that okay? In the book, um, when when do you say her name Leela or Layla?
Leela. Yeah.
Leela. When Leela goes back to school for the first time after her dad has passed away, she says, "Everyone knows I'm different now. I have a friend whose daughter passed away. She died just as an infant, and her older daughter, who was about 7 years old, that was her fear of going back to school, and everyone's going to know that I'm different, that you don't feel whole
Mhm.
without that person." Uh, was that something your children also experienced as they re-engaged with
Certainly,
people?
our family has experienced that feeling of being different in pretty much every sphere of our lives, from sitting in church and having that empty spot next to us, from the dreaded daddy-daughter dances in elementary school where there was no dad to attend, from the basketball court, sitting in the bleachers alone and figuring out how I could be both mom and dad. I'm not a loud cheerer when it comes to basketball
Okay.
games. And then all of the little, in between moments where you're running up against the reality that your life doesn't look like other people's. And, for our family, one of the ways that we have sought to really address that reality is to not sort of create our new family setting, our new family situation as our new normal, but to recognize that there actually is no normal in a broken world. That
Right.
particularly for us as people of faith, the church becomes a family. And so
Mm.
for us, we've got aunts and uncles in our church community who are really important to us. When we lived far from family, we lived a coast away, 3,000 miles away from family for many years. We had to develop a whole host of surrogate grandmas and grandpas, people who would come to birthday parties or to the Little League game and sit on the sidelines, people who would cheer our kids on at 4 H competitions or babysit for us. So, if you have lived far from family, you already know the skills of re envisioning family as something bigger than just the nuclear family. And while certainly the nuclear family is a beautiful thing, and it is certainly something to be honored and prized and deeply respected and supported, it's not the only way to be a family in a broken world. And I think that's a real comfort for children who are trying to figure out where they belong. That a teacher who is really attentive and shows up at a ballet recital can actually feel more like an aunt than just a
Right.
teacher. And that's really cool. We live
Right.
in a hyper independent and individualistic kind of society. And that kind of interdependence and community is a really beautiful thing wherever you find it.
I totally agree. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I do think some of the suffering that we have is because of our hyper independence and the idea that actually needing people or needing God would make you weak, when actually that is the glue that binds us together and creates such a beautiful network of support and love. Who wouldn't want that,
Yeah, that's so
right?
true.
Yeah, that's it's a message that is really that I'm very passionate about. Actually, I'm very passionate, especially for grieving people, to encourage them to find a church family, a and specifically because at least in a church family you have principles that are binding you together. It's great. I think it's great to belong to all kinds of clubs. There's a place for that, right? There's a place for every kind of combined interest. But when you have people who's who are people of faith, and their faith informs all of their decisions, the way they spend their time, the priorities that they pursue, the care they have for others. It's it's such a gift,
Mhm.
particularly when you are affected by grief.
That's
You
right.
know, those people, because of their shared beliefs and their desire to follow Jesus, will lift and bless. And I wonder with some of the people that showed up in your life out of the blue, how many of them have some background of faith
Mm.
that has informed who they are, that makes them go that extra mile, right? That
Yeah,
that makes them show up
that's
for
very true.
people. I have found that. I think the I think the worst way to grieve is alone.
Mhm.
I don't think that that's very good. I feel like we've had such a wonderful conversation. How did you decide to start writing your first book?
Well, when I began to look for resources after Rob died, I found a lot of really great practical secular resources that would talk about the ins and outs, what to do on holidays, or how to manage your finances as a widow, what to do with friends who were trying to help and you're trying to coordinate care. And I appreciated those books. They were the nuts and bolts kind of resources that I really need. But many of them, when it came to conversations about faith, sort of complained that faith was a pie in the sky salve to woundedness, that really, you know, it was taking you out of the realities of the hardness of grief and loss. And it wasn't particularly helpful for people who were bereaved. And as a Christian, I was sort of discouraged that I had to skip some of those chapters because that
Yeah,
wasn't my experience. But when
right,
I turned to Christian resources, I found that mostly everything was devotional. There was a lot of talk about heaven, there was a lot of talk about
right.
grief as a theological concept or from a devotional perspective. But I realized that if I was actually going for help to any of these places, no one would tell me why I didn't have an appetite anymore or why I had trouble sleeping anymore, um, why I couldn't figure out where I had put my keys because I had just set them down and now I couldn't remember. Uh, they didn't address any of those practical aspects of grief that are so much the warp and woof of a grieving person's everyday. And so I thought, what if we could consider putting those two things together? What if I could draw upon all of the best resources in bereavement research and theory, the best grief support resources that are out there, and pair them with something that was gospel infused, where a person could get those questions answered, where they could figure out why they didn't feel like moving anymore, but all their friends were telling them, you ought to go for a walk. And what to do with all the big emotions, what to do with their spiritual questions. And it could really give them an opportunity not only to build resilience, which we know from research is it's in our DNA. We are built to rebuild after hard things happen, and also give them a glimpse of resurrection. And we know that the blessed hope for a Christian is that in Jesus rising from the dead, our resurrection has begun, and so we live in that now and not yet. And so for a grieving person, we needed that nuance. We needed to understand that while we were struggling with our appetite, struggling with going to work, struggling with brain fog and relationships after loss, and the big questions that come along with it, we were, yes, living in the not yet, but we were also living in the now, that there was more to life than the difficulties that lay before us, that God promised us more in the now, that we didn't have to wait for heaven to experience his resurrection power in our lives. And so Beyond the Darkness really comes out of that. It's a practical handbook, a guide for walking through the hardest thing you've ever experienced and doing it honestly and with a lot of grace to yourself and with your feet pointed toward hope, because I'm convinced that hope is the thing with feathers. Emily Dickinson said it's going to take you places, and
Right.
it can only take you places when it is rooted in um, an honest assessment of reality.
I absolutely love that. Thank you so much, and thank you for that testimony. I That is my hope also comes in my belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And yet you are so right that most of the time when we look to faith sources, it's it's soothing, it's comforting, but it is about having faith in what will come.
Mhm.
And it and sometimes people can actually question their faith because their grief is causing such havoc with their mind and their soul and their body that it can look like they don't have faith because they're not being able to access that faith that they have felt,
Mhm.
times before. And I know one of the common um, the complaint that some people have when people of faith have when they are grieving is that they are given devotional books, and it just falls flat at the moment, because at the moment you're not feeling grateful, you don't want your loved one in heaven, you want them here. God didn't need what do you mean God needs him more? Those can be really hurtful comments. So I love that you put these two things together, and that is my next book that I am going to read. I am very excited to have this combination of really full truth, full knowledge, right?
Yeah.
I love that. I love that you said, I trust that in God's hands, grief can create something beautiful, even if its beauty is forever a stark reminder of what is absent. God is present even in life's darkest hours. As we walk with grief, Jesus walks beside us.
Mhm.
I believe that's true even if we can't feel his presence. And that's what brain fog from grief does. It can numb us to feeling the same feelings of faith and hope. And and yet what you have been able to experience in your life, what I've experienced and what I've seen countless other people experience, is this darkness doesn't last forever. And there is hope that comes. I want to just share one last part of Hope Comes to Stay. This is Leela's sweet conclusion from her experiences. Grief hadn't gone away like Cousin Virginia said it would, but it had brought other things to live beside it: courage, comfort, and happy memories. Yes, grief was still here, but hope had also come to stay. It just gives me goosebumps. It's such a wonderful book, Hope Comes to Stay. And Clarissa, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about it. And thank you for sharing the experience that you had with your late husband. He sounds like just a wonderful, wonderful guy.
Thank you. Thanks for this conversation, Julie.